I'm pretty sure I first met Jen, I think it was 29 years ago in San Francisco at Infocom in 1996. We'd both just finished our PhDs. Jen was at Michigan and I was at Berkeley. And I was presenting a paper called Achieving 100% Throughput in Input-Queued Switches. And Jen was presenting a paper titled Hardware-Efficient Fair Queuing Architectures for High-Speed Networks. And it was co-authored with Albert Greenberg and Flavio Bonomi. I was actually already a dyed-in-the-wool hardware weenie, having built routers and switches and stuff like that during my master's and PhD at Berkeley with Jean Moron and Praveen Varaya. And that was on the EE side of the house. At Berkeley, the EE and CS folks, despite being in the same department, actually didn't really talk to each other. So I didn't really feel part of the CS side. I didn't really know anything about that at that time. And by 1996, it was pretty clear that the internet research community was moving away from hardware and EE and towards computer science and computer systems and software. And as a new assistant prof, I was already getting a bit lonely as an internet hardware person, even back then. Infocom was good, but it was starting to be eclipsed by SIGCOMM even then as the best networking research venue. And SIGCOMM was already a bit kind of cliquey and full of itself, to be honest, even back then. But there in San Francisco, at Infocom, was Jen, a super articulate, fast-talking internet hardware weenie just like me. We'd all read the popular papers of the time, the whiz-bang packet scheduling algorithms like WFQ and generalized processor sharing and George Varghese brand new deficit round-robin paper. But here was someone talking about different hardware implementations of fair queuing. I had instant respect and kinship, and we've been friends and colleagues ever since. I know some of Jen's personal story, but I'm hoping to ask her some of the questions that, frankly, when you've known someone for 30 years, it's a bit late to ask them. And so I'm going to pretend that I'm asking on your behalf so I can find out more about Jen too, as well today. But my goal is for us to learn something of Jen's origin story, how she came to be the person she is today, and what it's like being the provost at one of the top universities in the world. Did she come from a family of academics, from researchers, engineers, scientists? What was her upbringing like? Was it one of privilege and entitlement, or did she have to forge her own path? Was she always destined to be a researcher, professor, and a big-time university leader? You probably don't know the answer to these questions about Jen, so I'm going to start by asking her about her background and then see if we can understand how this shaped her career path and her choices and the ups and downs along the way, as well as how she sees the world of networking systems today. I think that will be interesting to all of us. One thing I think you're going to notice about Jen very quickly is that she thinks fast, she thinks on her feet, and she's always super thoughtful. Oh, and so everybody knows, we're actually pre-recording this interview at the end of February so that it can be edited down to fit inside 40 minutes, which it will. And after the 40 minutes is up, Jen and I are going to appear live for some Q&A until the end of the hour. So here we go. Jen, welcome. It's great to see you.
You too.
Can you start by telling us a little bit about you, your origin story? Where did you grow up? What were your parents like when you were a child? And where they were from, and how did this shape who you are today?
Yeah, so my father was spent his career in the Air Force as a Korean linguist. And so we moved around a lot when I was a kid. I used to joke, we always moved only halfway around the world each time we moved. So we lived in Hawaii twice, in Korea, and Japan, and the DC area 4 times. So I consider the DC area home, but we sort of were back and forth quite a bit when I was a kid. My mom, because of all the moving, was a stay-at-home mom until I was in late high school, and then she started working as a college counselor at the local high school I went to. So she was involved in education. And I would say one thing that was noteworthy, my parents both really valued education. The moving around was challenging because I was changing schools constantly, but there was the continuity in the focus on education. And in some cases, a lot of time learning on my own, because I would arrive at a school behind in some things and ahead in other things. So there was always a certain amount of chaos with my education. So there was a lot of catching up and slowing down that went on with my education throughout the time we were moving.
So when we first met in 1996, I think it was, does that sound about right to you? I think it must be about then, right? We were both freshly minted PhDs. You were just starting at AT&T Research. So what were your aspirations and interests at the time? Do you remember? Did you think at the time you'd be at AT&T for your whole career, or did you already think that you might make a switch to academia sometime in the future?
Yeah, so you mentioned that the paper that I had at that conference. So I was already interning at AT&T in the summers. I had a fellowship from AT&T that paired me with a mentor, Albert Greenberg, who became my department head when I went to AT&T later. And so I've been working in the summers off and on with Albert. But my PhD work was in parallel computing, and in particular on the hardware communication inside parallel machines. And 2 years before I graduated from my PhD, all the parallel computing companies went bankrupt. And it became really clear also that the part of the problem I was working on, how to make communication inside the parallel machine with programmable routers, it's a theme that I can't discuss somehow, that wasn't really the main problem, right? It was how to get algorithms to be parallelized, meaningful applications to be parallelized. And so I had to sort of like, oh, gee, what am I going to do now? So I started leaning into ATM switching and networking. Like the web had just exploded in, the 93, 94 timeframe. And I said, wow, here's a place where there's real networks with real data, real applications, real users, and stuff that's up and coming rather than an industry that seemed to be falling apart. And so I started those last 2 years pivoting towards networking, and read Larry Peterson's early networking textbook. And I never took a networking course, don't tell anyone. But I started kind of learning because I thought the web was fascinating. And these little devices, switches, routers seemed like not dissimilar to what I knew about from parallel computing.
I see. But did you think you were going to be going to academia at some point when you went?
So I mostly for academic jobs as I was finishing grad school, and this sort of had this crisis of, gee, I kind of want to pivot my research area, and I also want to get more grounded in having better taste in picking problems. Like I felt like my PhD dissertation, your PhD, the purpose of it is to train you, and I got that. Yeah. But I feel like I would have picked differently if I had been a little more savvy about where the important problem was. Yeah. And so I wanted to be someplace where I was a little closer to reality, still doing research, but getting a dose of sanity check on whether the problems I was working on were really well-grounded. And so I thought, I'll go to AT&T for a few years. It'll be kind of like a postdoc, reality check postdoc. And then I fell in love with my work and forgot to leave and ended up staying for almost 9 years.
I see. So you mentioned about picking a problem. And, I think a lot of people, when they're first starting, I remember thinking about this when I was first starting out in academia. How on earth do you pick a problem? Can you say a little bit about how you go about it, how you think of it?
Yeah, so that lesson from grad school made me really interested in talking to people who are actually users of the technology. In the case of AT&T, that was network administrators. And that was something Albert Greenberg, who's my department head, was really interested in. I remember we went to, I think it was Sigmetrics that same year in 96. And that was where Mark Ravella was presenting his early work on measuring the web. And there are a number of papers at that conference that had measurement data. And he's like, look at this, like this measurement stuff is really, it's good to be able to do the math to model how you should allocate network resources, but the data is going to be really important. We should be doing that and doing it for network administrators, not just for sort of creating workload models or a better scientific understanding of the internet, although obviously that's important too. But Albert really had this insight that measurement was going to be a key ingredient to managing. And I got excited about that. I got excited about real data, which I lacked in my PhD. I got excited about real users, the people grappling with this new technology that was so different to manage than the phone network had been. And so for me, that really got me into thinking about real data and real people who are suffering real pain and looking for opportunities to alleviate their pain in the short term, and then look back and say, well, how did we get to the point that everything is so difficult for them, to try to also think in longer term strategies to solve the problem that the technology had induced for them.
How is that approach to picking a problem to work on for your research career? How has that evolved and changed over time?
I think during the time I was at AT&T, there was a shorter term immediacy, especially in the early years that I was there, where I would talk to a network administrator and I would try to formulate a research question out of the immediate problem that they had. And some of that was learning for me, and some of it was that internet research and internet practice were just not that far apart temporally. It wasn't like research was so many.
I guess it was, yeah, right.
Right. So my work was fairly close to the ground, to be honest. maybe sometimes too close to the ground, especially because that was so valued at AT&T to be helping. I mean, AT&T being behind in jumping onto the internet helped because they were much more, the practitioners were much more willing to let the researchers in the door because they really needed to catch up. And I think what's changed over the years is I've tried to still keep that approach of being inspired by the practical problems of practitioners, but to try to think of longer term solutions that are a little more, I want to say clean slate, or at least longer term in what it'll take to deploy them as time has gone on. And when I shifted to academia, that was sort of a natural, that was where I had started to get to in my own work. And academia was sort of a natural extension of trying to think a bit more long-term in what kind of solutions I worked on.
Go back to your time when you started at AT&T. It was sort of right in the middle of that dot-com boom. And I remember Mike Odell, you remember this? He was saying, if you aren't scared, you don't understand. And there were all these claims that the internet was doubling every 100 days. Yep. As we all know, it turned out it wasn't true at all, but which is something for us all to bear in mind in this day and age of hype about AI. We should remember that. But they were getting pretty giddy, heady, scary, and exciting times for those of us working in networking, weren't they? And you were right in the thick of the biggest networking company, right, in the world, working at AT&T Research. And what was it like? Can you give us a sense of the excitement, the fear, the sense of responsibility to society for this new incredible technology that was just changing the whole world?
Yeah, I mean, what was particularly exciting, I kind of hinted at it earlier, was just interacting with practitioners who are really making it all work with duct tape and baling wire. I remember I spent a lot of time talking with some of the folks at AT&T who had worked on the telephony network, and they would say things like, well, how do you know if you get the topology and the traffic matrix for the network, how is the routing going to work? And they would ask these well-posed questions, and I'd be like, golly, that's a good question. And we don't think about it that way. Like, we just have these protocols and they do their thing.
This kind of works.
And it was, so for me, it was kind of sobering that I remember some of them would say, Jenna, we're betting the company on this. And what do you mean it's dropping packets? Like, you should never drop a packet. Like, what?
And I think in some ways this sort of must have framed all of the interest and work that was going on at ATM, right? Because the telcos were looking at this toy cowboy internet thing and saying, come on, we need a grown-up network. Let us come in and manage and engineer it in a way that we're used to doing. And, conveniently, of course, the telcos would have been in charge and making all the money. It's kind of interesting thought experiment to think how the world would have been different had that actually been what happened. But and the future was going to be carried in 53-byte packets. Remember, people would have badges that said 53 with a line through it. So this is something that they didn't agree with. Can you capture for us the main arguments that were being made for or against ATM at that time in that context? Because it was, no one knew whether, I think we probably all assumed it was going to be the dominant network technology, and how that debate in particular was playing out inside AT&T.
So for me, ATM was kind of the gateway drug from parallel computing hardware to what later became internet routing hardware for me. So at first it was just like, oh, that's a good segue for me. And I think a lot of it was based on a number of assumptions. One is, hey, the packets need to be really small because we can't tolerate the sort of delay that comes from large packets getting ahead of a time-sensitive voice packet, for example. So some of it was an assumption that the multiplexing had to take place on a super small time scale because of latency. Not really true, but I think there was a perception at the time we would need echo cancellation equipment voice if we didn't. It's funny to think of it now, right? But there was worry we'd need nationwide echo cancellation equipment if we didn't have ATM. That's right. Some of it was that the packets had to be parsable really easily at high speed. That's why the header formats had to be fixed and simple and not hierarchical addressing, and because somehow hardware wouldn't be able to process at speeds. Again, not accurate. And some of it was this mindset, gee, we need to be able to manage the network. We need to be able to know what resources we need. We need to know what performance we're going to offer and be able to have a kind of top-down way of reasoning about it. And the internet was so not that.
Yeah, I think those of us outside of the telcos rather assumed that the telcos were populated by people in suits who were sort of counting the numbers and sort of saying, well, if this happens, we're going to lose all of this money. And that somehow you were all kind of told inside the telcos that you must speak this language, otherwise we're all going to go bankrupt. My guess is that the techie people were not thinking like that at all inside AT&T, but there was a certain mindset that just came from years and years of experience of building networks a particular way that worked, because telco networks had to work by law. And so, it sort of framed the conversation. So it set up these sort of opposing viewpoints between the telcos and the internet folks who were considered the crazy revolutionaries.
There's so many meetings I was at early at AT&T where someone from the sort of bellhead side of the company, if you will, would say, well, there are 5 things that matter: reliability, time to market, and cost. And if you can't do all 5, just do the first 3. And that mindset was really there. And of course, the internet is just the opposite.
Of course, yeah.
Of this. So it was just such a deeply embedded mantra. And I think a lot of my time at AT&T was, and I'm making fun of the bellheads, but at the same time, a lot of my own work was taking the good things about, needing to think rigorously about management of resources, or, needing to think about the control plane of a network. So
Absolutely.
a lot of my work, taking trying to distill what I thought were actually good lessons from the telecom network, and to figure out which ones were not applicable to the internet. It was, there's subtlety there. And I certainly made mistakes along the way in how to think about it. But I do think being there at that time and witnessing that culture clash was quite informative to me. So I tried to take what I thought was good and leave what I thought wasn't.
I mean, it takes me to quite nicely to the first of your papers that I wanted to ask you about, and that was it was the late 90s, and you started to work on BGP, and then in 2001, I think it was, you published what is, I know I've told you this before, it's my favorite paper of yours, and it was titled "Stable Internet Routing Without Global Coordination." And this was a real eye-opener for me at that time, because it described how AS administrators around the world can independently pick their local BGP policies while still allowing the global BGP network to converge. So in some ways, it was that reliability question, right? How you reliably converge upon a good routable network and the tables that you would need in each of the routers. I should point out to everybody that this paper barely makes it into Jen's top 20 most cited papers. But to me, it was a big deal because it helped stabilize the internet in a real practical way by providing principal guidelines to the folks who spent their days and nights trying to run it. So many people on the call probably never read, may have never read this paper because it's just such a long time ago. And if you haven't, I highly recommend that you do. But can you give us a quick summary of the main results as they were at the time? And then with the benefit of hindsight, what were the biggest takeaways for you?
So Li Gao, who's my co-author on that paper, was on sabbatical at AT&T, and we'd been working together on multimedia streaming, completely different topic, but she wanted to do something different during her sabbatical. And there'd been a paper also at Sitcom from Tim Griffin and others showing that interdomain routing could be unstable, and that it was actually quite difficult to even ensure that it would be stable. Each network is picking its best path based on the options its neighbors makes available to it. And that can just go in circles. I pick my best choice that makes you change your mind, that makes the next person change their mind. And there's oscillation. And we sat there during Tim's talk thinking, do you think this really happens? And we thought, gee, it can't, because there would be chaos if it was happening. And we had access to AT&T's configuration data. So let's go look and see, how is the network configured? Do we think we're only looking at one node?
I see.
Right? So we're not going to be seeing everything, but we wondered maybe there were design patterns that were in the configuration data that would tell us maybe configurations are not like this. Mm-hmm. And that started there are AT&T has peers and providers and customers as business relationships. And as we started the model, well, where does the money go? Money doesn't go in circles. And maybe if money doesn't go in circles, the routes don't either.
I see.
Right. That so led us to start modeling. So you described it as kind of prescriptive. To configure your network a certain way, things will be stable. And that's true. But I think for us, we were thinking a bit more descriptively. Like how do
people actually do it? And so why did it work? Yeah.
Yeah. How is it that AT&T decides who they tell about their routes and how they pick the routes. And it's based on the money, right? And then we thought, oh, if everybody else is
doing it,
a rational actor like that, how would the emergent behavior look at? And then it's much more constrained. And the punchline is, if everybody's doing what's selfish, everything's fine.
I see.
Because money doesn't go in circles.
And similar paper that came about a little bit later, but really in this idea of trust and reliability for the internet was RCP and the routing control platform, and that really presaged much of the later OpenFlow and SDN work and network virtualization, etc. So, to what extent? Again, casting your mind back to that time in the context of that time, to what extent was RCP informed by or about solving AT&T's problems, the direct problems of those network administrators? And can you remember where you thought this was leading? Because with the benefit of hindsight, it was so prescient with what came later to do with ossification and all the ideas leading through, clean slate thinking for the internet. Do you and your team think at the time that it was going to define how AT&T's future network was going to be built, or was it really a research contribution to this sort of budding idea of change of control?
At the time, it was very focused on AT&T's problems, and we had been taking, the network protocols AT&T runs and kind of imposing management on top, tweaking configuration of BGP or of intra-domain routing protocols like OSPF, and it was so frustrating. I mean, we were developing these tools that were reverse engineering how the protocols worked and inverting them so that we could tell them how to be configured so that they compute the right answer. So, there was a lot of unnatural acts being done to coax the network into doing achieving a high level goal that we had for the network. And after a while, we're like, golly, the software base that we're accumulating, we've got this huge software base on the router, and we're creating another one to reverse engineer and control it. Golly, where is this going to lead? This is going to lead to this massive code base, and we're constantly worrying, do we have every detail modeled right? And, it was very painful and kind of maddening, right? Because sometimes we would be like, okay, we know what we want the router to do, and we're not allowed to tell it. And AT&T spent more money on network equipment than any other company in the country, and we're still not allowed to tell the frickin' router, like, what to do. Right? So it was a little bit of we're starting to get annoyed. And I was talking with some of the bellhead folks, if you will, about these problems. And they said, well, there's this paper from the 80s on the telephony network, on the network NCP, they called it, the network control point.
Okay.
Go read these Bell Labs technical journal papers. And I'm like, oh, God, it's another bellhead telling me and yet another story about how great the phone network is. And then I read these papers and I was like, oh, we should have a logically centralized stored program computer that tells the distributed set of telephony switches what to do. And I was like, wow, what a great idea. And then the question became, if we were to do that in the internet setting, what would that mean? It wouldn't mean the same thing. It would be setting up telephone calls or doing caller ID or call forwarding. It was a completely different set of applications. But then I started thinking about what would that mean and translated into these route control problems, traffic engineering or planned maintenance, all the kinds of things we were trying to do in unnatural ways. And it was really, and that's why we call it the RCP, as sort of a nod to that paper from the 80s around the network, the NCP. It was just to think, oh, well, if we had direct control and centralized direct control and visibility, what would we do? And then it became a kind of system challenge. Can we really do all that on one computer? And that became an engineering problem to figure out, how do we do all the computational work? And then Moore's Law was our friend. A single modern computer had more memory and CPU than hundreds of routers combined that were a few years old in AT&T's network. And that and a little bit of good engineering tricks, you could do on a single computer the computation for the whole network.
Yeah. I think it's stories like this that remind me of things we used to discuss at the time that, I think with hindsight, actually, what we came to call SDN was kind of inevitable because, even if all of that stuff on Genie and Find and Clean Slate and Ethane and 4D and OpenFlow had never happened because, Moore's Law are making the processors, the availability of cheap, fast switching chips, and And the separation, allowing people to use modern software practices running on those servers to write the software that they would need, and turning it into a software problem. Hey, everything else in the world was going that way, and this was just something else. And that's where all the expertise was. And really, what it was about, kind of, it was addressing a business problem more than a technical problem of how those who own and operate networks, like AT&T in the RCP case, how could take control of the network and define how it behaved for themselves, rather than having to rely on whatever, Cisco or Juniper or whoever it was choosing to put inside their boxes, with this conveniently skinny little interface that came out of the top for so-called network management that no one could really use. And it conveniently contained all of the protocols and all the opportunity for change inside the boxes.
So when Shane came, you asked me earlier, were we thinking about this in bigger ways beyond AT&T? And we really weren't, to be honest. We had a very practical problem we were trying to solve, and we tried to do it in ways that were backwards compatible with the legacy routers, because we didn't have open interfaces like OpenFlow. Obviously came later. Hui Zhang came on sabbatical to AT&T, and we're telling him about the RCP work. And he's like, Jen, you're so apologetic. It's like you think you're doing this because you have no choice, but maybe it's actually, even if you had a choice, maybe you should be doing it.
It should be the best way. That's a good observation.
And I have to say that this is a recurring theme. I mean, there are these people that would come on sabbatical, like Li Shin or like Hui, who were not kind of steeped into the sort of very immediate things that I was frankly a bit preoccupied with. I'm not sorry about that. I mean, it was part of my journey to really understand operational practices, and sometimes, it got so beholden to trying to make them better in the short term that I wasn't zooming out. And then people would come on sabbatical like Li Shin or Hui, and they would say something, and I'd be like, oh. And that's when we started thinking about what became the 4D architecture during Hui's sabbatical. It's like, if you were doing this on purpose,
yes,
then what
do you do?
And would it be only for route control and BGP and, things like that, or would it be for other purposes? And for me, that was really edifying. And that work happened just in my last year or two at AT&T, where I stayed a little longer before going to Princeton to get RCP deployed in the AT&T backbone. So I was super excited. It was running in the AT&T backbone, and also working with Hui and others on what would this look like if it was a thing.
If it was the way that you, that way,
and thinking in these sort of in more intentional ways, if you will, was something I was both ready to do and in a position where I should be doing, because I wasn't going to have the same immediate access to network administrators that drove so much of what I was doing the time.
And it's funny how these things work in these synchronized ways, right? Because there were all the folks that were in the discussion about what led to Genie, and how would you actually build experimental ways to try different ways to build networks. I think there's a lot of sort of, I don't know how these things happen, sort of synchronization of these ideas. Maybe we were just all listening to the same people who were complaining about how things were, or it just the dam was breaking. Because I think that, in many ways, what we were all talking about was, from a business point of view, is how do you take the keys away from the people that build the closed boxes and hand them over to those who have the not particularly enviable job of building out and then running and operating these huge networks. I mean, no one that's ever designed a chip or built a router has ever run a big network. People who run big networks do that, and they know the problems they need to solve. And if they can actually do that in the software, and I think all of these had that kind of common theme. It's easy to say that with hindsight. I'm not sure we kind of really understood or appreciated that at the...
Yeah, I remember an early conversation with a vendor when I was at AT&T, when we were starting to work with NetFlow, to really start to collect really fine-grained measurement data. And they had it set up in such a way, because of the overheads on the box, you could either run NetFlow or you could install access control lists. So you could either detect denial of service attacks or block them.
But you couldn't do both.
But you couldn't do both. And I would be, I'd be arguing with the vendor, like, come on, I need to be able to do both. Like the point of the measurement is I'm using it to manage. And again, that was another moment for me. It was right as I was trying to decide whether to leave. I'm like, this is nuts. Yeah. Like, this is nuts. I should be able to see and do.
Do you think there was a collective feeling? I think we may have all said this as a caricature at the time, but did it actually really feel as though the network equipment vendors had a stranglehold over those who own and operate networks like AT&T?
Indeed. I mean, there was a monopoly or a duopoly. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's not just that had a stranglehold, but they often didn't have experience running a network. I remember, again, one of them was like, hey, NetFlow, I wanted more bits. I wanted more data, more fields. And they said, well, we can't get rid of the IP version number field and in the NetFlow data. And I said, but it's 4. It's always 4.
It's always 4 at that time. Yeah.
I don't need it. Give me, the TCP header fields or, something else. But there were so many times where there would be conversations where it's like ships in the night. Like, it's so obvious I need X and you don't understand why I need it or why I should even be deciding that I get it.
So all of this conversation was going on right at that time when you were thinking about or in transition from AT&T over to Princeton. And, there was all the talk of network ossification, things like this. And so presumably this kind of really shaped your initial research thinking, the things that you'd learned at AT&T, the things that you'd learned as you struggled with many of these things, as you were starting out your research group at Princeton, right?
Yeah, and I think there were two people that I connected with a lot my first few years. One was Larry Peterson and the Planet Lab work, which was really taking off at the time. And the second was Meng Chang, who, along with the others, was looking at the role of optimization in the design of protocols. And so my work at AT&T, we'd have these protocols we couldn't change, and we would impose optimizing their configuration. And so it was clear optimization was important, but the protocols weren't really designed to make the optimization easy. Everything was indirect and hard and unnecessarily messy. And then Meng and his colleagues were thinking about protocols as distributed solutions to optimization problems. And so we started doing work together. If we could define the optimization problem and synthesize the protocol or derive the protocol that is the distributed algorithm for solving that problem. So that became really an exciting area for me in my first few years. It's like, optimization is key, but it should be in the story from the beginning rather than bolted on. That was sort of a big thread my first few years. And then Larry was like thinking about Planet Lab and programmability of distributed services. And I started thinking, wow, we could make Planet Lab a network that was programmable instead of a distributed services platform. That would be really cool. And so he and I started, thinking about taking his ideas one level lower in the stack. So those were the two threads that were, in my first few years, really exciting for me. And also let me work with people that had expertise of a type that we didn't have at AT&T, right? So there were things that I didn't know I was missing, but then soon did.
Liberation from the confines of working within a particular company to be able to work on whatever you wanted, right? It's
and with the kind of expertise that there's certain kinds of expertise a particular company naturally doesn't have, because it seems like it's relevant to the business, and yet may actually be just the thing you need.
It was about that time that I kind of developed this idea for picking problems. Was it had to be problems that industry didn't like yet, and it was in part because I think that it was a balance between two things. One is, if a problem that you wanted to work on was a problem that industry knew that it had, then it should go work on it because it had way more resources that it could apply to it and could move much faster. And the flip side of not wanting to work on it was sometimes just that blinkering, because it was like so devoted to the here and now that these problems that were perhaps over the horizon or challenged the way that they were thinking, then they weren't going to work on it, and that's what we should do. It left space for us to do. And I think, if I look back on what a lot of us were doing at that time, it sort of had that feeling, which was we were looking for the things. Industry was investing a massive amount in trying to fix all of these things, so we needed to pick things they weren't going to do, and it was sometimes the bit that they were missing is like, there's a completely different way to do it. And I think that helped a lot. I want to move on to a different paper. And that was another paper of yours that I really love from 2012, SIGCOMM, that was Abstractions for Network Updates. So as far as I know, it was the first SDN paper that was accepted to SIGCOMM for 5 years after Martin's 2007 ethane paper. I may have this wrong, but but in the meantime, many of us were getting rejections with reviewers saying things like, "Oh, this SDN thing, it wasn't accepted by industry yet." It seemed kind of backwards, right? Surely research should lead industry, not the other way around. Anyway, a lot of this is kind of sour grapes with the benefit of hindsight. But let's return to that 2012 paper on abstractions for network updates. To me, it really shone a light on something that you can do once you take control of the network. So can you tell us a bit about the motivation and thinking behind the paper?
When I was at AT&T, this is a journey for me. I used to work in the night shift in the operations center and shadow network administrators. I learned a lot doing that. But one thing I learned was that planned maintenance was just such a pain. And there would be all these transient disruptions when they had to take some equipment down to, fix something or upgrade the software. There was an incident where tens of thousands of Sony EverQuest gamers all died, their characters all died at once because they got disconnected during a maintenance. So that became a kind of rallying cry for the RCP, actually, right, to be able to better control planned maintenance. So it always bugged me that even the RCP was kind of somewhat clumsy, less clumsy than the way they were doing it before. And then this work, what it was exciting to me was, hey, if we can tell the switches the rules they should apply and decide the order in which we tell them, then we can transition the network from one state to another without the packets in flight experiencing some hybrid mishmash of the old and new policies. And working with Nate Foster, who had done a postdoc in my group, and Dave Walker in PL, so they had these really nice ways of thinking rigorously about the kinds of properties we wanted to preserve across an update. Mm-hmm. And the OpenFlow interface gave us a language for the instruction set, if you will, for that we could use for writing the program for making that transition. And so for me, that was just a really fun opportunity to finally come full circle to something that should have been easy and then was.
That paper has a nice property of being one of those ones when you see it and say, oh yeah, of course that's how you should do it. And but it has that elegance and sort of simplicity that's built out of some new capability, the fact that you could program this for yourself. So I love that. I love that paper. So before this gets too much of a love fest and we agree on everything, I want to see if I could pick something that we might not agree on, right? I'm going to try and come up with something these two. I may fail. So in 2014, you wrote a really widely cited paper that was entitled The Road to SDN, an Intellectual History of Programmable Networks. And that was with Nick McKeown, you just mentioned, and Ellen Zagura. So the paper, it kind of walked us through what must have been a fairly difficult tightrope to walk at the time, as it sort of tries to tease apart what were the historical trends and the ideas that led to this thing that got called SDN, which, as we know, is ill-defined and a kind of an amorphous blob. And there were indeed many folks who saw the pitfalls of letting the router vendors sort of keep their boxes closed and proprietary. And in the 1990s, there was lots of the DARPA-funded work on active networks. And there were many of us that thought that this approach of, for example, in one version of active networks, packets would carry programs that would then run on the routers. It wasn't the only way that it was, being manifested, but this is a sort of the one that became the poster child for active networks in a way. And many of us thought this was wrong approach, had too many performance implications, too many security implications, and it seemed really unlikely to be adopted. And in many ways, OpenFlow was about trying to design with adoption up front, and we're not really therefore kind of inspired in the positive sense by active networks. We always used to say, correctly or incorrectly, it was kind of more inspired in the negative sense by it, in that it was a fixed, simple, not programmable way in the data plane. Am I being too nitpicky? What do you think about this?
I think that's fair. I did find active networking more inspiring. You do say in the negative sense, and perhaps that was true for me too, but I think that's good, actually. I mean, when I was at AT&T, all this active network stuff was happening, and I was watching it from the sidelines. It wasn't really so germane to my life, and I was intrigued about wanting there to be a unified way of thinking about network functions and having greater programmability. But I was concerned with, well, who's the programmer? To me, it should be the network operator, because again, I was preoccupied with that user in mind. And why wasn't that the person who's the user or the programmer instead of the end user? And I was worried about performance because, again, I was in a very sort of practical mindset. So I think, like you, I was thinking about it in the negative. But some other things that came up there, I think one is the lighter weight form of active networks is exactly what Planet Lab is. Right, a header in the packet demultiplexes you into a program context. And in fact, Larry, when I asked him about it, said Planet Lab came out of his desire to do active networking in a practical way.
I see. Yeah,
that's sort of one thing Jonathan Smith, who was very active in the work on active networking, really thought a lot about programming languages researchers connecting with networking researchers. He's the person who introduced me to my own colleague at Princeton, David Walker, and got us time. And so who knew, how could I have been working on programmable networks since my PhD and not thought that PL was something I should have been paying attention to? It was kind of one of those moments, but Jonathan really, in his active networks work and in his own sort of recruitment work with me, got me thinking, oh, I should really be paying attention to these programming languages researchers and what they're doing, because it'll help. No, so again, the platform's not the same as active networking, but virtualization, programming languages, who should the programmer be, how to make it performant. For me, I was influenced a lot, maybe in some cases reacting against, but in some cases pulling disciplinary threads that I found really helpful in my own work later. So I guess I have a positive spin even on the negative reactions, if that makes sense.
There you go.
And there's positive things too around the disciplinary hooks.
And of course, those links with PL and Dave Walker and Nate on the formal verification side, et cetera, really pull together a lot of the power that came from once you've got something which is, a system or a network that's designed like a distributed system rather than a collection of protocols, you can start to think and reason about these things. And, I think that's been a real eye-opener for both of us and really influenced.
Something networking is about scarcity and about expressiveness, which seem at odds, right? A lot of work, whether it's on optimization or on compact data structures, it's all about trying to work with in a scarce, limited resource environment. And then you've got network operators who want expressiveness. They have so many things they want their network to do. And finding this sort of connection between the resource scarcity and managing resource scarcity and managing the desire for expressiveness and getting it just right. I found collaborating with optimization and algorithms people on one side and PL and verification on the other. That's defined my time at Princeton, are those sort of pair of connections with other fields that I didn't realize were so important earlier in my career.
I want to ask a meta question or a sort of a meta point. As anyone that's watching this can probably guess, I wrote out a bunch of questions in advance. So I know what I'm going to ask you next. So if I sound articulate, it's because I knew what I was going to say. But one of the things you'll probably notice about Jen is she just talks and she's articulate and she's super clear. And if you've never, ever heard Jen give a talk, as soon as this is over, go find one online and watch it. Jen has this amazing superpower to communicate super clearly, forcefully, in great detail, and never stops to say or I don't know actually how you do it. But seriously, can you tell us a little bit when you're preparing a talk, technical talk, how do you go about preparing that?
One thing I did a lot of in grad school, because my advisor had me do it, was he had me present other people's papers to him. I would read a paper, and Albert Greenberg, when I was early in my time as an intern at ATT, had me do this as well. So presenting other people's work, because then your own understanding of it is really basic, and their technical details you don't mind jettisoning because you haven't fallen in love with them. Right, your own work, you're so in love with the technical details.
Of course, yeah.
Really hard to rise above them and be faithful to them.
Uh-huh.
Talking about other people's work, I think helps in that. I certainly found that helpful. But I think it's frankly just a lot of iterative refinement. It's preparing a talk and then the practice talk goes horribly and you're just mortified at how bad it is. And practicing and practicing and practicing, even up till right before I give a talk, I'm practicing the first 10 minutes or first 2 minutes even of the talk and like, oh, that's awful. And it's the sort of constant iteration. Editing is easier than writing. Right.
Yes, absolutely.
Revising is easier than preparing a talk. So I wouldn't. Yes. I would say it's the iterative revision that's the more important than the actual start point. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I remember as a grad, I think it must have been as a grad student at Berkeley, when I think it was Dave Patterson gave a talk about how to give a talk. I think it was actually a talk about how to not give a talk. But the thing that surprised me was that people who give a lot of talks were spending a lot of time preparing them. Because you just assume that they make it look so natural and so easy. It looks like they're just sort of, off the cuff talking about their research or their work, and that they've done it so many times it must come easy. And one thing that I've learned is for all people that I know that give good talks, yourself included, they prepare. They think it through, they practice, and they give a lot of thought to how it will land with the audience. I think this is a very maybe with experience we just get better at hiding the fact that we're doing that.
Exactly. So Farnham Jahanian, was a professor of mine in my last couple of years in grad school. He and collaborated with him as well. He used to give amazing lectures in his distributed systems class, and they were hysterical, lots of jokes. So I asked him one time, I said, do you prepare your jokes in advance? And then you could just see him looking like, well, actually, yes. I think, well, I prepared the first couple of jokes because once people laugh, it gives me the confidence, and then I'm off to the races. And so I thought that was great advice. Like I try to prepare the first 2 minutes of the talk. So once I get going, I'm okay. But the getting going is hard.
Absolutely.
And having a joke or two in the bag and having people react positively, it just kind of puffs you up.
Absolutely. Every sort of roughly Christmas time, Don Knuth gives a talk at Stanford, which is on some collection of papers that he's read recently and something he's been writing. He still does this to this day. And I remember taking a group of my students say, I want you to come and see how a really, really good talk is given. And Don kind of shuffled into the room. He had scraps of paper that were flying everywhere. And he was sort of scrawling on a piece of paper with an overhead camera. It looked thoroughly disorganized. But it was all through it was this storyline and these jokes, little dry comments as he was doing it. And it would seem completely random, but somehow it all steered through into this perfectly told story. And I was sitting there thinking, damn, this failed, because he doesn't appear to have prepared at all. He just can do this completely naturally. And I failed in my attempts to have the students see what it looks like when someone is really prepared. So I went up to him afterwards and I was, going to ask him, so how do you do that? And then I noticed on the set of scrap papers on his desk was a really detailed outline of how all of this was going to go, including a couple of jokes. I thought, okay, all right, that's good to know.
Yeah, exactly. It's all done with first.
Dawn, another kind of meta question or service question. I've had the great pleasure to witness some of your really legendary mentoring skills, particularly for women who are studying for their PhDs in networking or any area of computer systems. Several of my own female PhD students have reported that they wrote to you to ask questions. They didn't even know they were doing this about all sorts of things. You replied almost always the same day at length, no matter what the topic. You write lengthy recommendations for people, and you contribute ideas to what they should be doing, always encouraging and always pointing them towards new opportunities. I've heard this from many women in our field and from women in computer science more broadly, from all sorts of universities as well as at Princeton. I have enormous admiration for how on earth you do that so easily and giving so freely of your time. This is something that, just to embarrass you, everybody who knows you says this about you. I asked a few people, so, what should I ask Jen? And this came up again and again. So it makes me wonder about your journey as a woman finding her own way in a male-dominated field, how it must have shaped in some way, and how it led you to devote so much of your time to helping out those who followed.
Well, first of all, I was just really fortunate to have amazing mentors. I mean, Albert Greenberg, I've mentioned multiple times, Farnham Jahanian, Craig Partridge, yourself, Jim Perot. I mean, so many people that devoted time to helping me. So some of it's a pay it forward kind of thing. I also find when people ask these questions, I'm sure you feel this too. If someone comes up to you at a conference and asks you a meta question, or even the questions you're asking me now, like it's a moment for introspection, and the process of answering the question is the opportunity to be asked the question is a gift too, because it forces you to stop what you're doing and lift up.
That's very true.
And writing is thinking for me, right? And so I don't always start intending to write a long response, but then I get so into it because I'm like, oh, that's such a good question. It's so interesting, and I get into my head about it. So it's almost I would almost call it journaling.
I see.
That makes sense. Sort of to someone asking, and maybe wanting advice, but it turns into journaling.
You also have the benefit that you type really fast. I've watched you type.
A little secret. I was a Kelly girl for a summer,
Oh, wait.
I don't know if you know Kelly Girls were this
Yeah.
stuff now, but they're this typing crew, and I had a summer job as a cleric doing clerical work, and government memos were written in WordStar in the late '80s, which was the editor used for Turbo Pascal.
Okay.
So I was in high demand because I could type fast and I knew WordStar. And so I was sent out into all sorts of incredibly boring jobs that required fast typing.
So it sort of also explains why your paper reviews are legendarily long. They're the longest and most detailed I've ever seen. And I'm going to tell you, I've been on program committees where it was supposed to be anonymous reviewing. Say, oh, that one has to be Jen. It's so long and detailed. And one thing I've heard people say is that they learn more from your reviews than from the paper that you're reviewing. There's so much detail and insight into that. And you serve on many committees, from chairing ACM Sitcom and TPC chair for numerous conferences, co-founding IMC, and list goes on. How do you do it from a time point of view? Because you must be thinking very carefully, particularly in the job you're doing now, but always in terms of how you prioritize your time. And somehow you manage to make time, immense amount of time for these services to the community.
Some of it is an inability to say no, and we'll probably talk about no coaches.
Yes, we will.
Because you've been my no coach, but you often rope me into doing things because you forget to advise me to say no. So some of it is that. Some of it, the reviewing, is kind of the journaling thing again, right? When I'm reviewing a paper, I get excited about some missed opportunity in the paper or something that could be written differently, and so some of it's paying a dividend because it's part of intellectually engaging, and I find that. Yeah. It's a reactive form. It's not like I'm picking to spend my time on this. But it's causing me to drift into a direction I wouldn't have explored if I weren't asked to review this random. But I do think it pays a kind of dividend, actually, even though it might seem like it's only service. It actually is paying a dividend. And I think the other things like creating IMC, the story there is, Bala Krishnamurthy, Vern Paxson, Christoph Dio, and I were at a SIGCOM PC meeting. All our papers on measurement got rejected. We all had a little too much to drink at the reception after the PC meeting. Like, nobody likes our papers. We're really our conference. And so some of it was a little bit of we don't like, the community seems to not like a direction we think matters. We're going to make our own. And so sometimes it was a little bit of annoyance, if you will, with the community. Like, let's create a sub-community that shares our values or understands that this is the right direction to go.
I suspect that this is how most workshops and new conferences is probably how NSDI came about too.
Yeah, exactly. And some of it is an opportunity to say, I think this is the right way to go. And actually, I'll have more influence if I can get others to come along than I will with anyone. I mean, we're all bandwidth limited, right? I can write papers for students, but obviously producing our students matters more than producing our papers because they amplify, right? They go out in the world and
absolutely
and do amazing things. And same thing, whether it's creating conferences or communities. When you create communities, you're hopefully leaving a mark that scales, right? It's a lever for affecting change beyond what we might be able to do in our own scholarship. So I find that really rewarding, actually.
So as well as being a pioneer as a woman in a male-dominated field, you've also been a pioneer as an openly gay woman in computer science and electrical engineering at a time when, there were so many obstacles and prejudices. Now, some of those obstacles feel like they're coming back again right now. But can you talk about your experience and what you've had to overcome in your career?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always felt that being a woman in computer science and being a lesbian were like one happened at work and the other happened outside of work. And because the gender imbalance in the field was such the dominant thing. Yeah. That the sexual orientation thing was always second order. And I think especially in the early part of my career and my early part of my personal life, I was more compartmentalized of, the work and non-work. And I think one of the joys of caring less what other people think is you don't feel the need to compartmentalize your personal life from your professional life as much. And then you get to know people better and everything's a lot more fun. But I think I experienced the gender aspects of the male-dominated field. And in some ways, ironically, could be one of the boys a little more easily. And so there was some, I don't mean to say that it was all positive, but there's an aspect to being one of the guys that I've always enjoyed, and whether it's office mates in grad school or group mates at AT&T, that I found in some ways almost that was easier
I see. Yeah.
And I experienced, I did a lot of, volunteer work along with my now wife in LGBT issues. But I always thought of that as like, that's my outside of work thing. Inside of work, it's women in STEM. Outside of work, it's LGBT rights. And it took me a while to realize I was like split braining that. Because they obviously both matter to me, but I had sort of different lanes.
Of course. Yeah. No. And I can only imagine. And then now that you're in a leadership position at the university, presumably these sort of silos and partitions between different parts of your life and different parts of the world, they're all going to get smushed together naturally just because of the immensely broad things that you have to think about, work on, figure out for policy and budgeting and all that kind of stuff that happens in a university.
Yeah. And when I talk to LGBT groups, I talk about compartmentalization, right? That's often a coping skill for dealing with a culture that's not accepting, right? People compartmentalize to avoid having to deal with things, and that getting past compartmentalization is a big part of the journey.
I must say, and this is something else that several people have said about you. This is a gen therapy session here.
Yeah.
You always make it look so easy from one success to another. Yet, most of us go through periods of feeling down, frustrated, pissed off. And, times when our imposter syndrome is in full force. I know it's happened to me. And can you talk about your own experiences in that regard?
I mean, I've hinted at a few of them during earlier parts of the conversation. I think I thought my PhD research was on the wrong problem, right? So I had a lot of I didn't have good judgment in picking problems, right? That was sort of one. I think I felt at AT&T, gosh, I'm spending too long contorting myself around the technology we have now. I mean, you talked one thing I really admire about your work is you don't mind picking problems the industry hates right now. Right. And I think that I think I've gradually gotten there, but that wasn't where I was. I remember when I first started working on this programming languages stuff with Nate and Dave, I remember someone in industry saying, well, Jen doesn't normally do things that aren't sensible. So this stuff seems crazy, but it must not be. I was thinking, it's not an insult or a compliment. I'm not sure.
Right.
But in a weird sort of way, it actually got more people willing to pay attention because they assumed it couldn't have been too crazy if I was,
Of course,
if I was doing it. But I've sometimes been a little risk averse in that way, where I do find sometimes the here and now a little more compelling. So that's a place where sometimes am I taking enough risk? That's another. I think a third is that I work a lot with other people who are experts in wielding a particular disciplinary hammer, whether it's programming languages or verification or algorithms. I'm very rarely the expert on anything that my papers are about. If you look concretely for what is the key disciplinary hammer. So sometimes I wonder, maybe I need a hammer.
I've witnessed some collaborations that in a good collaboration, everyone feels like that.
Yes.
Because everyone is learning from someone else and everyone's in awe of what so obviously it comes easily to everybody else because that's their discipline and their field, but they're actually usually thinking about us too, I hope.
That's a good.
Maybe I'm a freeloader. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think when I have imposter syndrome, it's like I'm bringing a lot of people together, but am I actually doing something that's technically deep, right? So sometimes is there technical depth in what I'm doing or not? And then sometimes I think, well, it doesn't matter if the work comes out well. It's not important, actually.
I think the great thing about a conversation like this is that it becomes a bit of a surprise to people that someone for whom has had great success has all of these questionings of what they do. You heard it first here. Jen just said that she felt that she was risk averse. We don't think that about your papers, but your questioning, and that questioning, I think, serves a great a great service because it always makes you examine why you're doing something and am I doing the right thing and how can I do it better? And I think that although we often think of it as a negative, the fact that we kind of get, oh my gosh, I'm worrying about this thing. We all do it. And then how you channel that into saying, well, how can I do it better?
Yeah, I think, again, I tell my grad students often the key is to fall in love with your work, but not so much that you're afraid to criticize it and yet not be paralyzed by the criticism, right? It's a delicate balance, right? Where you need to be harsh and receive harsh criticism from others, reviewer, PE, or your advisor or whatever, and often from yourself, and yet still keep going. And yet also can not be so in love with your work that you don't accept any of the criticism.
I want to talk to you about running the university. It's always seemed obvious to me that you'd end up in a big job like this. You always had the vision, the people skills, and the frank, straightforward nature. Actually, when you seem unflappable when thinking about problems. So we needed someone like you running the place for sure. But provost at Princeton, my God, that's a pretty big darn title and responsibility. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to go into university leadership, and a little bit about what your daily life is like these days?
I mean, I think for many people, it's a bit of a slippery slope. I was, director of graduate studies early in my time at Princeton, and then I was acting chair, and then I became department chair. So these things all happened in baby steps, where each time I'm like, okay, well, that was interesting, but I don't want to do the next thing.
Sort of boiling the frog. Yeah,
exactly. It's a little bit of that. But I will say, I mean, not unlike the research work I do and the community service work I try to do, I really like creating platforms, whether that's, technical platforms on which programmable networks run, or I like to be infrastructure to create. I tell people when they ask what I do in my work, I say I'm an internet plumber. I really like to think about the infrastructure, and all these academic administration roles are like that too, right? You have these brilliant colleagues or brilliant grad students, and you're trying to think of how can I do something that's, again, a lever that I can do a little work here and make a whole bunch of other people more productive in what they do. And so I think what I'm finding rewarding about the provost job is it's on a much larger scale and causing me to have to learn about parts of the university I knew zero about before. But it scratches that same itch of like, well, what's the intervention I can make that will unlock something that let them do great things. So there are amazing people all over the campus that if I can unblock them in some way, I'm getting more done than I would get done myself.
But it must mean that you have to deal with things that are really either mind-numbing or frustrating as hell, that you really wish that you didn't have to deal with, or things that are just probably really tricky to navigate, things with protests, things with big budget changes, government changes, all that sort of thing that, it's like a first experience of like, it's easy to sit in a chair in a faculty office and throw stones or, tomatoes or whatever people are doing. But actually then to have to make the decisions, that must sometimes be super taxing and frustrating.
Yeah, it can be sometimes a little lonely because there's a difference in the relationship you have colleagues too, right? Because now you're on the when you're a department chair, I think people think you're taking one for the team, and then I think once you're in any role kind of higher than that, you're there's a little bit more skepticism. Like, okay, now you're an administrator, you're not one of us, and there's a little bit of I would say that's one of the harder things, and not being in the classroom at this team.
Okay.
Quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But I think that what I've really appreciated is that the other people that are in these kinds of roles at the university we're all part of a team. And it's a little bit of that same interdisciplinary thing. It's like, gosh, our communications or government affairs or legal person, like they're experts on distilling a complicated situation of the type that you're describing. In some cases, it might still be my decision or my working with the president on a decision, but I've got these experts who have the hammers I lack. And it's often like, wow, that's really interesting. Like that's a thing. I didn't know that. I mean, I knew it was a thing, but I didn't understand the art and inside nuance of it in a way that I've been learning so much of the past 2 years.
How would you advise a young faculty member? There's probably quite a few watching this interview who are kind of contemplating and mulling over, or perhaps they've been asked, would they be department chair or, maybe one day. How do they think about whether they should get into university leadership as well? It's probably not for everybody. But there are probably many people who could do it who choose not to. How would you encourage them to think about it?
I think in every academic job, there's sort of an expectation of some level of service within the university, especially after tenure, not always as much before. And one piece of advice I got that was really good is you're going to have to do service. It might as well be on something you're passionate about, right? And so my first several years at Princeton, a lot of it was on women in STEM and to some extent LGBT issues as well. I'm like, okay, well, I have to do service. So I was like on every committee related, like the department, the School of Engineering, the university committee on anything related to, these topics that I was really passionate about. And so that gives you the bug, right? Because there's something you're you actually have conviction about it. And so then you're no longer phoning it in because you actually care enough to actually spend time on it.
Yep.
And then people don't ask you to do other things as much because you can say, well, I'm doing this, so I can't do that. Right. And so I think that becomes a bit of a gateway drug to.
That's great advice. I wish I'd heard that earlier in my career, because I must say that there were at least a few committees that I served on where I ended up realizing I was phoning it in because I wasn't passionate about them at all. And picking and choosing ones that you feel passionate about, it's actually really good advice.
The other thing I think early in someone's time as an academic, I came in because of my industry time. I was I didn't go through that young professor period, but I think the first thing people typically do is, academic advising or director of graduate studies, doing things that are directly related to the teaching and graduate mentoring that they're doing. And that's great, right? Because then they're not having to context switch into a different topic. And so I think if you observe yourself and say, I'm actually enjoying this, like I know I have to do it and I want to do a good job, but I'm actually enjoying it. And then that starts to help you think, well, gee, maybe I want to participate in the committee at the university level that thinks about these issues.
Yeah.
And then gee, I'm curious, how does this institution actually work? Like I spend a lot of time here. I'd like to have a mental model. One thing I've been doing a lot lately is going to department chairs and explaining the things I've been learning the past 2 years. So it's kind of like I'm teaching. So I've been trying to gosh,
nice.
There's stuff as a department chair I didn't know that I kind of think I'd have been a better department chair if I know some things that I've learned the past 2 years. So I've been, maybe I miss teaching and that's what it is. But I've been trying to chairs this is what I wish I knew.
I'm going to change tack a little bit. I'm going to ask you about sacred cows. So when I was doing an interview of the Networking Channel with Amin Vedat last October, I asked him a bunch of questions on so-called sacred cows of networking, things that are kind of hard to question, assumptions that are made that we all hold to be true, that, when you poke at them a little bit more, you're going to wonder, really, were they true? And I'm kind of curious what your take on these topics are. I'm going to start with the same one that I asked him. I always felt as though we wasted a decade in networking because we believe that resequencing packets is expensive. And, I really strongly disagree with this. And I built NICs and software stacks that really cheaply and easily resequence packets at the destination. I just think the network design, IP, is supposed to allow to resequence packets missequence packets if it needs to. And particularly if it helps the network perform better for fault tolerance, more bandwidth paths, and less congestion. So, would you agree?
100%. And I think
that we're on a better path now.
I do, pun intended.
Okay.
No, but this is one thing I've really liked about your work is so many of us don't have a deep understanding of hardware. And so there's often, I think a lot of the sacred cows are, this is too expensive to be done in hardware. Right. And it's often wrong. All the ATM discussion we're having earlier, we have to have fixed packets. I have to have a fixed flat address. All these things ended up not being true. But if you take them as received wisdom and you don't have a choice because you don't have the hardware expertise and you're not around other people who are questioning it, you take that as a given and it becomes an embedded assumption in everything you do. And so that's hugely unfortunate. But 100%.
Yeah. In other words, those kind of hardware like sacred cows that kind of drove me nuts there was this sort of always this idea that implementing lots of QoS levels or priority levels in hardware is really difficult. I remember, and you probably remember too, in those days of ATM, the first ATM adapters had thousands or tens of thousands of QoS levels and queues. And that was 30, 40 years ago. So it's not that difficult to implement in hardware. I think it's just that we've never quite figured out what to do with them. And it is, would you agree, is that, or, what is it that's sort of held us back from being able to exploit or take advantage of having many different types of service and quality of service in the network?
Yeah, it's part of it. I would say also that per flow queuing, it has some cost associated with it, but if you had it, I remember in those ATM days, if you had it, congestion control would be easier, buffer management would be easier, all sorts of things would be easier, but no one of those things alone got so much better. Having the feature, maybe we'll get, incrementally better, but none of them was enough to kind of push it over the edge. It was kind of like MPLS. It's MPLS would make these 10 things better, but no one of those things was so hard without MPLS that you had to deploy MPLS to get it. Maybe if you sort of could get past the tipping point to the other side, you'd be like, oh, everything's easier now.
Yes. Yeah.
But you didn't, it's again, the frog boiling in water kind of metaphor. You don't necessarily no one thing kind of pushes you to have to make the choice.
You mentioned earlier about measurement, and I think we both agree that networks would have worked much better a long time ago if they had much more measurement built into them and much more observability built into them to really examine what the network is doing. It's much easier if you get to sort of define that for yourself, either in the software or in the hardware in the forwarding plane. In some ways, that more of that is happening now. But there's always been this assumption that it's somehow hard or expensive, like you were saying earlier about NetFlow. And I've always thought, no, I don't think that's the case. I think it's just that no one knows where to put this information in a way that doesn't break their network. And it's we're just kind of lazy.
Yeah, and I think things like NetFlow, if it had just been packet sampling and you didn't have to store anything in the data plane, it would have been better from the beginning. Right. But because it kind of grew out of route caching and there was all this sort of state associated with keeping the measurements on the device.
Yeah. That
led us down a path where everything seemed expensive when it actually would have just been better to sample and export the stuff. And it would have been simple and easy.
I suspect there's lots of topics like this, and I always thought it'd be kind of good to have a website or a workshop on sort of myths and sacred cows of networking, because we've all got our own things that kind of drove us crazy, where folk could get out on the table things that drive them crazy and have debates, and sometimes we find that we were wrong after all, and where we find that our collective thinking is kind of flawed or missing or kind of a little bit blinkered. It could be fun. And anyway, if anyone that's on this, on the call wants to volunteer to help set something like up, I think there'd be quite a lot of interest in it. So I also asked Amin for a list of 3 to 5 books or papers that he felt that we should read. And I want to ask you the same thing.
I think one was, kind of early in my career, was load-sensitive routing is unstable. The early ARPANET papers kind of showed that, and I think it became received wisdom. And it was maybe the particular way the ARPANET tried to do it wasn't stable, but there's plenty of really lovely pieces of work, TechCP and others that showed you really can do load-sensitive routing in a stable way. But for a long time, it just seemed like, no, there's no point in trying because that's a thing. And a second is that the 4-layer internet architecture is what the internet is actually like today, and it's just not, right? If you look at a packet middle of the internet, it's got 13 different headers on it, probably 3 IP headers and some Ethernet headers and a whole bunch of other headers as well. My colleague Pamela Zabe and I, we just published a book recently we call the Real Internet Architecture, that tries to look at how does the internet actually work today?
Yep.
And is the end-to-end argument really still the right way to explain it? Is the 4-layer stack really the right way to explain it? And our answer, as you could probably gather, is no, actually, that the internet's evolved immensely, not because we added a whole bunch of new protocols, but we composed them in all sorts of funny ways that the current textbooks don't.
It's a super thought-provoking book and really makes you think about the fallacy of much of what we teach, and also helps you think in a much more principled way about what actually is it and how has that become over time. So, anyone that hasn't seen that book, take a look. It's super interesting. Okay, I'm going to ask you some quick questions that probably have some quick answers. Okay, AI for networking or networking for AI?
Both are interesting. I'm more interested in networking for AI because I think there's we're plumbers, right? So we make things run better.
So what was your?
Yeah, but I think that we can't make the AI for networking work well unless we have the right measurements, right? I mean, if you don't have the right data, AI is not going to help. So
absolutely,
you got to solve the telemetry problem first, and then we need networks that are amenable to being AI managed before we can really do the AI.
Great point. So what was your biggest mistake or failure in research, and what did you learn from it?
I think it's been sometimes spending too long close to the ground. I mean, to our conversation earlier, that there are times where I think that's useful as part of the learning and part of having short-term impact, but figuring out when to zoom out. I wouldn't say it's any one paper. It's more, when would have been the right time to zoom out? And sometimes I feel like I zoomed out late.
Which paper that you wrote or a co-author on that when you read it now makes kind of cringe with regret? And just to set the tone here, I'm happy to tell you mine. I wrote this paper in 2002 with a student called "Is IP Going to Take Over the World of Communications?" I'd like to say it was tongue in cheek. It wasn't really, and it just makes me cringe when I read it today or I think about it. Is there one in your past like that?
It's again, I think, this set of papers that maybe were a little close to the ground. There's a paper that I wrote with a number of people when Hui was on sabbatical, looking at if you take the forwarding policies in a bunch of network devices and compose them together, like what is the network doing? But we didn't have like an open flow, like clean model of what the data plane is. And so the model just was super complicated, in terms of trying to realize what the forwarding policy for the network was, because we were looking at the protocols that existed today, not at the data plane. And then when things like space analysis, Veriflow, and all that, I'm like, like that's so much cleaner.
Can you say something about no coaches?
Yes, everyone should have one or two. Someone that you go to that tells you that you shouldn't do something you're thinking of doing. And the introspection that provides. You were my no coach. I didn't go to you often, but I invoked you often. Like, I need to write Nick and ask, should I do this? And as I tried to write the note to you, I thought, God, this is so obvious. I shouldn't do this. I'm embarrassed to even ask my no coach. So I think having some discipline to not say yes in real time, to introspect a bit, and if needed, have someone make an intervention to keep you from harming yourself.
So I learned about this from Jen, and we agreed that we would be each other's no coach. And so I had exactly the same experience. There were many occasions where I thought, I need to ask Jen. And so the idea is you ask them, and then they can say no on your behalf or tell you you'd be crazy to do it. And most of the time, as she says, just the question of thinking about it and being slightly nervous that she can say, duh, it's so obvious that you shouldn't do it. That you should say no. That wouldn't even say it.
A mandatory waiting period before saying yes is already helpful, because my knee-jerk reaction, especially if someone asks me in person and it's a worthwhile thing, I'm like, yeah, sure. Then you have to learn to train your lower brainstem to say, that's an interesting opportunity. I want to think about whether I have time to do that justice and get back to you in a day.
Jen, thank you. I wish we could keep talking for hours. In fact, I'm pretty sure we could talk for hours if we could. I hope that even though you're now a big muckety muck with a big, great big one job, that you're going to continue to do networking research and stay in touch with us. And but finally, is there anything else you want to add before we finish up?
No, I think thank you. This has been a blast. I've really enjoyed it.
Me too. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Jen.